Thank you guys for joining us today on our webinar, 2018 Farm Bill, Tribal Opportunities in the Conservation title. Sorry we had a little bit of a delay with a tech issue, but we are good to go now. We appreciate you taking the time to be with us out of your day. First of all, I wanted to establish kind of where we're going to go with today's presentation in terms of the direction and kind of a roadmap. So first, I'm going to hand it over to my director of the Indigenous Food and Agriculture Initiative. We're based out of in Arkansas, and Colby Durham. He is going to talk about introducing our work and a little bit of the Farm Bill. I'm going to give kind of an overview of the changes in the 2018 Farm Bill, specifically focusing on the working lands programs a little bit later on EQIP and CSP. And then from there, we're going to have Carrie Jo Lawrence from the Intertribal Agriculture Council talk more specifically about the EQIP enrollment process. So with that, I am going to turn it over to Colby and let him go from here. So whenever you're ready, Colby.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Blake. And good afternoon and good morning if you're joining us from Alaska and Hawaii. Thank you all for being on today's webinar. Again, I'm Colby Durham. I'm director of the Indigenous Food and Agriculture Initiative here at the University of Arkansas. Just a little quick bit about the Indigenous Food and Agriculture Initiative. We were established at the university in 2013 in the School of Law by now Vice Chancellor, but at the time Dean Stacy Lees, and our founding director Janie Sims Hett. We've since moved in July of 2018, along with Vice Chancellor Lees, to the Office of Economic Development for the university. And we think that this really fits in with the mission that we were founded with our founding director to enhance health and wellness in tribal communities by advancing healthy food systems, supporting diversified economic development, and cultural food traditions in Indian country. We have a lot of different projects that we work on, including a scaling up project, which is funded by the W.K. Kellogg Foundation to help tribal producers take the next step in their food and agriculture production. We do food safety training for tribal produce producers to help comply with the produce safety regulations that have come out. And we're developing an alternative curriculum along with that. We also have our Native Youth and Agriculture Leadership Summit, which is entering its 7th year. We also have our Model Tribal Food and Agriculture Code project, which is a free resource for tribal governments and offers a starting point and a 19-chapter starting point for tribes that are looking to be able to develop their own food codes. And we do technical assistance and training as part of that as well. And in addition to that, we also are the research partner in the Native Farm Bill Coalition, and that's some of the work I'm just going to touch on today. With that work, along with the Native Farm Bill Coalition, which was founded by the Intertribal Agriculture Council, the Shakopee, Metawakan, and Sioux community, and National Congress of American Indians, and including us at IFI as a research partner in 2017, have worked on the 2018 Farm Bill and put forward different potential opportunities for changes, which precipitated into having 63 new tribal provisions in the Farm Bill. We're not going to talk about all of those today. We've done a lot of webinars that discuss that, which are available on our YouTube channel, and so we're happy to share that information out there. But today, I think we wanted to be able to kind of focus a little bit on the conservation title, talk about some of the specific changes in there. But before we get into that, I would like to just kind of do a quick overview of the Farm Bill for folks and kind of what we do, and also talk a little bit about our work. And I think we mentioned a lot of the different things that we do. We touch a lot of different things, a lot of different areas within food and agriculture, but we really see our work as putting the tribal sovereignty and food sovereignty. And so through our role as being the folks that do legal analysis, policy research, and provide educational resources, we try to be able to empower Indian country through food sovereignty, agriculture, and economic development. So looking at how the Farm Bill kind of is structured and can help with this, if you can go to the next slide. Farm Bill is a 5-year bill that does get reviewed every 5 years or thereabouts. This year was the first time they've done a Farm Bill on time in about the last 5 or 6. It was passed as a $428 billion bill for that 5 years. It's important because it's one of the only really truly rule-focused pieces of legislation that Congress passes that actually is funding an agency like USDA that has almost a solely rule focus. It's also the second largest non-defense spending bill that Congress touches. and it provides the vast majority of funding for USDA's programs. Essentially, almost every program at USDA, but for some of the child nutrition programs, school lunch, school breakfast programs, as well as those are handled in a package of bills called the Child Nutrition Reauthorization. But the Farm Bill itself, because of being so large, is broken into 12 different titles, as you can see there. A lot of them cut across different areas and work together. And as we'll be highlighting conservation, I think it's important to note that conservation is important because a lot of times for producers to access other programs within the Farm Bill or within USDA authorities, particularly if you're looking at crop insurance or other programs like that that help support producers, you either have to have a conservation plan or be working with USDA's Natural Resource Conservation Services. That's almost sort of the entryway into USDA programming period for producers. So if you go to the next slide, you can see that the vast majority of funding in the Farm Bill is dedicated to nutrition, and that, of course, is the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, or SNAP. That also includes the Food Distribution Program on Indian reservations as a small portion of that. So a substantial amount of funding goes to it. But if you look, one of the other largest pieces of the whole funding pie is conservation at almost 7% of the bill. And over time in this Farm Bill, it actually increases in the amount of money that is going to be dedicated to conservation. So it's an incredibly important title. We know that there are a lot of tribal producers and tribal enterprises that utilize the conservation programs at US Today. So we're very excited to be able to highlight this and talk about that, and then also have Carrie Jo from IAC to talk about being able to enter into one in particular, the EQIP program as well. So with that, I'd like to pass it back over to our policy officer and staff attorney, Blake Jackson. So Blake, take it away.
Thank you, Colby. That was a really good overview and very helpful, and kind of setting the stage for the remaining pieces of the discussion for sure. Moving on, before we get going really deep into the conservation title, it's kind of important to maybe kind of establish a good base in the way that these programs sort of fit together and in the ways that they are implemented, because they look very different in some ways, and in some ways they're the same when you think of the overall goal of soil health, soil quality, and natural resource conservation being the underlying goal of all these programs under the Natural Resource Conservation Service. But again, the way that they're implemented is very differently, and they kind of fall into 4 different buckets here. We have working lands, land retirement, easements, and partnerships and grants are the big focuses here. There's a couple compliance ones and whatnot dealing with crop insurance, but we won't get into that today. This is more geared toward these 4 areas. The working lands programs are voluntary programs that allow you to keep your land in production, but you implement some sort of conservation practice to address resource concerns that have been identified specific to your area. Land retirement programs means that you take your land out of production and you receive some sort of a federal payment as an ag landowner for those temporary changes or management to achieve these environmental programs. So you take that land out of production, you get a payment from the federal government essentially for implementing some sort of conservation practice that you're getting payment for basically in lieu of the income that you would have received had that land been in production. Now, easements, you have a permanent land use restriction voluntarily placed on that land in exchange for government payment. So one thing we think about a lot of the time, if you think of your property rights, you have what we call the bundle of sticks kind of in the legal field. You have the right to exclude, the right to use your property, you have your airspace rights, you have all the different rights that are associated with your property right. Well, this essentially gives the government one of those sticks and gives that government that property right, and that easement gets put into some sort of restriction so that land cannot be used in a certain way anymore. But in order to get that restriction put on there, you do receive that payment in exchange from the federal government. Partnerships and grants are basically leveraging partnerships with cost shares with non-federal funding, providing grants to states, tribes, and research organizations. So basically finding outside resources to leverage federal dollars to accomplish an end goal here. Now, in this following slide, you can see maybe some of these programs that you've heard about before. The ones that we're really going to focus on today are the working lands programs, but that's not to take anything away from some of the larger other programs. Under the land retirement classification, the Conservation Reserve Program is a very huge one that is used far and wide and throughout Indian country. But the two that we're going to talk more about today are the Environmental Quality Incentives Program and the Conservation Stewardship Program. But we touch on these other ones because some of the underlying provisions in the 2018 Farm Bill did provide a pathway to make some changes in these other classifications to allow for more tribal access to programs or provide more resources that to these existing programs that already had maybe a pathway for tribes to access, but they didn't have as much funding or some sort of pathway or resources devoted to tribal populations as they do after we got out of this past Farm Bill. So with that, it's important to kind of look at how these conservation programs, how the spending has been allocated on them throughout the years. As you can see historically, based on the yellow on these charts, Conservation Reserve Program was and still does continue to be a big part of the spending portfolio here. But as we've kind of gone back in time, we've seen kind of a reduction so much in these land retirement programs like the Conservation Reserve Program and an increase in these working land programs, specifically EQIP and CSP based off of what is here. So given the utilization of these and some of the provisions in the Farm Bill that have opened up new pathways for tribes, we felt it especially fitting to have a webinar dealing with some of these programs that may or may not as be familiar with some audiences, but offer some great benefits once they're implemented and followed appropriately. So I want to touch a little bit on the Environmental Quality Incentives Program to kind of set the stage for Carrie Jo's discussion here in a little bit. The CRP, or excuse me, the EQIP program provides technical assistance and financial assistance to producers and private landowners to plan and install structural, vegetative, and land management practices on eligible lands to alleviate natural resource problems. And so what happens here is a lot of times you'll have a conservation project under EQIP that you have a cost share with. And with doing this, socially disadvantaged and beginning producers are eligible to receive a 50% advance payment for the cost associated with making these changes to address these structural, vegetative, or land management practices going forward. And it's carried out through a plan that you, as the landowner or producer, you work with USDA to identify the appropriate conservation practices to address the identified concerns on your land. And now, the chart on the right is derived from the USDA, and it shows the number of acres and thousands of the EQIP active and completed contracts going on today. So as you can tell, they're very diverse, widely used throughout the United States, more so in the central and eastern regions, but still a very robust program that's gotten a lot of attention from the field and both resources for USDA to implement. And the EQIP funding under the 2018 Farm Bill started out at $1.75 billion for fiscal year 2019 and 2020, but we see that increase gradually all the way to a little over $2 billion in fiscal year 2023. And it's important to know that the length of these contracts for EQIP vary, and they can last up to 10 years, but they'll most last for about 1 to 3 years. And the contract activities are kind of carried out according to that EQIP plan of operations that you develop in conjunction with USDA, and identifies that conservation practices or practices to address those natural resource concerns. And some examples of these are like vegetative and structural conservation practices could be terraces, marine waste lagoons, irrigation equipment, grassed waterways, filter strips, and wildlife habitat enhancement. Specifically with the management practices, we have the conservation crop rotation, nutrient management, drainage management, integrated pest management, and also these practices are subject to NRCS local standards and adapted to local conditions. And just a couple of things to note with the recent Farm Bill changes, funding dedicated to livestock practices was reduced from 60% of total allocated funding to 50%. But we did see an increase in the wildlife habitat practices increased from 5 to 10%. There's a $37.5 million annually for air quality concerns, and it provides up to 90% of costs for highly beneficial local and regional priority practices, which states can identify up to 10 of those practices to receive that 90% cost being paid. We move on to the Conservation Stewardship Program, and it is a program like EQIP that is a working lands program. So it provides the financial and technical assistance to producers to maintain and adopt additional conservational practices on their entire operation. So basically, as a participant, you're paid to improve, maintain, and actively manage your conservation activities in place at the time that you apply, and then adopt new conservation activities during the 5-year enrollment contract. Now, CSP, I will say, has underwent some changes with this farm bill. Mainly, we've seen a little bit of a change in terms of the way that it's calculated. It went from an acre-based program to a dollar-based program, but the goal is to afford greater flexibility and greater investment in local priorities. And we can see that funding here does gradually increase from fiscal year 2019 being 700 million all the way to above about 1 billion in fiscal year 2023. And now we do have some current initiatives that are paid as part of this legislation. Cover crops are one that receive an incentive payment equal to 125% of a normal CSP payment rate. Research conserving crop rotations, management intensive rotational grazing, and additional advanced grazing management are incentives worth 150% of the annual payment. And there are funds set aside for transition into organic production. Formerly, opportunities had existed to re-enroll if you had been willing to adopt additional conservation practices and to address these priority resource concerns. In the new Farm Bill, there's no longer the automatic renewal, but there has been specified that existing contracts that are already in the queue will keep going in order to transition to the new application process going forward. So now to touch on kind of some of the pieces of the Farm Bill specifically, with regard to the CSP and EQIP programs, we see the alternative funding arrangements as part of the conservation title being implemented. An alternative funding arrangement is a lot like a 638 authority, but a little bit of a different flavor under NRCS. But what this does is it requires USDA to work with tribal producers and provide alternate funding arrangements under both EQIP and CSP. So what this means is if there's maybe a conservation practice that's being implemented that doesn't quite fit the rubric for NRCS or USDA, and potentially that could kick you out if it's a traditional farming practice, traditional conservation practice that didn't fit those kind of criteria. This allows sort of a way for the secretary to enter into an agreement with the tribe to say, you can administer this program, and even though this looks a little bit different, it still addresses those priority resource concerns identified, and kind of allows an alternate pathway for tribal participation in this program. Now, formerly, this authority did exist as a discretionary authority under the 2014 Farm Bill, which basically said the secretary may enter into an alternative funding arrangement under this authority. What this 2018 Farm Bill did was take the may and made it a must or a shall, making it a requirement for the secretary to enter into these new arrangements. And since the 2014 Farm Bill, we have seen 3 alternative funding arrangements being entered into, but only one complete one with the Gila River Indian Community for an irrigation project administration. So hopefully going forward, this will offer new opportunities for Indian country and tribes to take direct assumption of these programs for the local tribal producer. Next, in the conservation title, we see furthering tribal access to conservation programs. Specifically, the 3 that I'll hit on here are the Regional Conservation Partnership Program, the Conservation Reserve Enhancement Program, and the Clean Lakes, Estuaries, and Rivers Clear 30 Pilot Program. RCPP is a program where partner entities, state and local organizations, Indian tribes, nonprofits, and farmer organizations submit a conservation project proposal to NRCS addressing those particular needs where the applicant is situated in the region. And then the proposal is selected, then eligible participants apply to NRCS to participate in the project. So what happens here in the 2018 Farm Bill is it explicitly includes tribes who own or operate eligible land as producers eligible to be partners in this program. We see the Conservation Reserve Enhancement Program as a part of the Conservation Reserve Program, which is the country's largest private land conservation program. It's administered by the Farm Service Agency, but CREP targets those high priority conservation concerns identified by a state, and those federal funds are supplemented with non-federal funds to address those concerns. So basically, in exchange for removing that environmentally sensitive land from production and establishing that permanent resource conserving plant species, farmers and ranchers are paid that annual rate along with other federal and state incentives as applicable per each CREP agreement. It's a voluntary program, and the typical contract length is about 10 to 15 years here. But what this does in the 2018 Farm Bill is it allows the Secretary to enter into these cost share agreements with tribes and among those other local partners that being discussed specifically with the state partners. So we see an increased access here with tribes being the eligible partner. Now, the Clear 30 pilot program is a new program that allows the Secretary to enroll expiring CRP land into 30-year contracts devoted to practices that improve water quality, and it allows the Secretary to contract with Indian tribes for the maintenance of the Clear 30 contract project that is ongoing. Additionally, we see more further access here regarding beginning and socially disadvantaged farmer or rancher set-asides. We see it reauthorized at 5%, both for CSP and EQIP at the historic set-aside rate. And we also see the funding of a conservation reserve program transition incentives program. So what this program does is it allows land that is toward the end of a conservation reserve program contract to be either leased with an option to buy or sold to or transferred to a new and beginning or socially disadvantaged producer, of which tribal producers are included in that. And it provides an additional financial support for a little bit longer to that person whose land is expiring under that CRP contract. So those are just kind of some a flavor of what the Farm Bill entailed for conservation specifically. At this time, I'm going to turn it over to Carrie Jo to speak specifically on the EQIP program. I'm going to turn it over real quick, but I'm going to switch up the presentation to Carrie Jo.
Okay. So will you be controlling the presentation on that side?
Yes, the way it's set up, yeah, just let me know when you're ready to hit the next slide and I can keep going.
Okay, great. Thank you for inviting me to do this presentation today. I'm going to get into the weeds a little bit more on how to apply for EQIP. And it's a little bit tricky because I know that NRCS is going to be moving towards using new ranking tools. NRCS is going to be moving over to the CART, which is the Conservation Assessment Ranking Tool. And it's supposed to be an improved and efficient application process, and but we'll see. But there are several things that will have to happen on the producer side, who is the participant, and the planning side. So I don't think those processes will ever change. So I think that's what I'm going to kind of concentrate on today. So go ahead. So how to apply for USDA NRCS conservation programs, and again, concentrating on EQIP. Go ahead. So for any of the programs, establishing eligibility is going to be the first step. And I'm taking it all the way back to for people who have not ever worked with USDA before. So the first thing that would need to happen is, make an appointment with FSA, because they are the agency who is responsible for doing the eligibility side of it. So if you can get an appointment with them and get your farm and tract numbers assigned to the land that you operate. And of course, almost every county has a USDA service center, and you can find that service center information on the website. And the other way to find that information is to contact your regional IAC technical assistant. There is one in all 12 regions, and you can go to our website at indianag.org programs to find who your technical assistant is. Okay. The things that you would need to bring to that appointment is proof of control of land. So if you brought in your lease, a copy of your deed to the property, one of the most important things too is to bring any modifications that may have been made to your lease or permit. Strictly talking on Indian land there. Let's say you had somebody added to your BIA permit. That's important to know so all of the participants can be accounted for. Providing your social security number or your EIN number, or partnership. So if you could bring those papers with, and then of course the documentation that shows who has the authority to sign on behalf of the business, that's important to bring as well. The paperwork that you'll be completing at the Farm Service Agency would be the AD 1026, and that's the questions that they ask you about highly erodible land and wetland conservation determinations. You'll be looking at your AGI, your adjusted gross income. So with that, you'll be answering a few questions, and then the USDA will record the average AGI certification, and then they will forward it to the IRS. And that has to be done every single year for people who are participating in the USDA programs. Otherwise, you will not be eligible for the payments. So that's something to definitely remember. And if you're part of a business, that CCC 901 would need to be signed and filled out. And it takes a lot of time for the paperwork to be processed. So it's really important to start that process early. And if you're going in the day of the cutoff date and you don't have your eligibility done yet, then you're going to be looking at probably another year of waiting. So many of the program application forms require the application to provide sensitive and financial information. And the participant pretty much has to provide that, otherwise you would not be eligible. So, and then that certain forms must be resubmitted each year, and I was specifically referring to that AGI form. So go ahead. Okay, so you're eligible. So for applying for conservation programs, the recommended first step would be to work on getting a conservation plan put together. So I've been told that with this conservation assessment ranking tool, which they are calling CART, I heard that once you get your conservation plan put together and put into this CART system, the CART system is going to put forward some alternatives and some recommendations on which of the programs would most fit your situation. So I think, I'm not sure how all that's going to go, but really work with your assistant there or your planner who is in the NRCS office, or get a hold of one of the IAC's technical assistant people, because we can help you at least get your plan started. Get that inventory done and get some alternatives set up so you're prepared when you go in there into the office. You need to decide on which conservation practices you'll want to include. And then, because I'm referring to South Dakota mostly because that's where I worked last. The NRCS would not rank your application unless you had a plan all in place, and that included having if you had a pipeline plan, the design needed to be done too. All of the engineering work needed to be done up front. So, so going through the application process, you'd complete a NRCS CPA 1200 application. That form must be signed and dated by the applicant, and of course you would have to have that. It's a year-round application process, but each year they have what they call a cutoff date. So everything received up to that date may be looked at to be ranked. The CPA 1202 Appendix explains the rules of the programs, and then you also need to complete an 1199A direct deposit form, which seems really weird during just an application time, but that's a form that you'd also need to complete. Okay. So here's a copy of the 1200 form, and you can print it off the internet and fill it all out, but you still need to have the NRCS will have to put it in their system. So if it were me, I would just ask the office to fill it out for me if they have all your information. And if not, there's certain questions that you need to answer on there because it's a self-certification. So go ahead. So like say number 8, and that's kind of where I'm referring to, that being a self-certification type question. And so if you have limited resource, or if you're a socially disadvantaged or beginning farmer, especially, and then the veteran too, the definitions there are written on the form. Go ahead. And then again, that's page 3. And then there's an organic question. And go ahead. And then you sign in date. And that's the application that you need to have on file by the cutoff date. And then go ahead. And then this is the 1202 appendix, and this spells out all of the rules and everything that you need to know about the program. Go ahead. Okay. So for program applications, participants will have already worked with their planner to complete a conservation plan. The application will be ranked based on the decisions made during that planning process. And it's really important to remember that the decisions are made by the participant, by the land manager. They're the decision maker, and not the NRCS planner. My best advice is not to agree to practices if you don't plan to complete those, and if they're not really what you want, but you might get a few extra points. That's not really a good way to go. Just really do and agree to the practices that you want to do that will improve your operation. Your application is given a ranking score based on national, state, and local ranking factors. After the funding cutoff date, the highest ranked applications are funded until the money is exhausted. And if your application is not funded, you may reapply each year. And you can find more information about conservation programs on the NRCS website, or by contacting your regional technical assistant from the IAC. Go ahead. So I guess I don't have too much to add, but just that there are changes coming, and hopefully they're going to be good changes. It's supposed to be more efficient application process, but really the most important thing that I can stress to people is get eligible and get your conservation plan completed and ready. Even if they change each year, just have something ready. So if you have any questions, please contact me. Thank you for your time.
Yeah, thank you, Carrie Jo. That was great, and it was really good to kind of see how a deeper dive into these programs kind of operate on the ground level. And thank you for your insight and your experience both at IAC and the insight you've offered from your time at NRCS. It's just really helpful to have that, especially for our audience today, I would imagine. With that, Carrie Jo's contact information is here if you have any questions regarding signing up for these programs. I'm going to switch